Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this pretty late retrospective for 2021. As I said in my Outer Wilds video, I didn't really have the energy to work on this kind of video after putting so much effort into that one. But I did feel like I was wasting an opportunity not to talk about some cool indie games I played all the way back in last year. So if you like, you can take out the date and year context and view this just as a general overview of some games that I have thoughts on. Some positive, some negative, but all played. Yeah, they were definitely all played. Have you ever had a job? How about a job in an office? Okay, well, what about a job in an office with an overwhelmingly corporate atmosphere that projects an aura of polite hierarchical dominance in order to suppress and control any new arrivals caught in its insidious web? I imagine there are more people than you'd think that fit that very specific latter situation, and it's this phenomenon that the makers of Say No More have very firmly in their sights. In the world's first no-playing game, you take on the role of a fully customizable young adult just starting out work at a huge nameless corporation. In the beginning, your character is extremely meek, unable to even answer back to their friend and roommate, let alone combat the passive-aggressive jokes of their superior. On their first day, after being encouraged to say yes to everything in order to fit in at work, they're subjected to a barrage of requests that they just can't pluck up the strength to turn down. To cap it all off, just as they sit down to work, their supervisor practically demands that they hand over their lunchbox to him, replacing the one that he'd forgotten to bring. 5 minutes in and already exhausted, the intern slams their head against the keyboard, only to dislodge a cassette tape from the rafters above. Upon listening to it, they're transported to an astral dimension, where a guy who looks like a cross between Hulk Hogan and Grunkle Stan teaches them the art of saying no. From here, the game actually begins, taking the form of what might be best described as a visual novel / art game. Perhaps on-rails shouter would be a more appropriate phrase. Your character moves through the offices, confidently turning down pointless task after pointless task, opposing middle managers and executives alike. On the way, you learn different ways to say no, and a number of techniques to humiliate your opponent into dropping their guard before you decline their request with style. And that's really all there is to the gameplay. As far as I can tell, it's impossible to lose at this game, even if you fail to respond to certain timed events. There are some encounters where not saying no can lead you to additional scenes, but generally, with the exception of a few encounters that need specific types of no, you can pretty much coast through by tapping one button when necessary. This isn't the point, of course. Say No More is probably more accurately described as a simulator rather than an actual game. The writing is excellent and really nails the polite yet coercive nature of the corporate world, where new recruits are seen as vulnerable and ripe for exploitation. As such, this will probably appeal most to employees of these offices, or those who have had experience of this environment. It definitely has potential as a virtual space to blow off steam after a frustrating day, or maybe build a little confidence yourself. The character creator is surprisingly extensive, so building a character that looks and talks vaguely like yourself makes it a lot easier to self-insert. The truth is that you can't always say no to everything in real life, but between saying it rarely in reality and saying it all the time in this game, you'll probably be able to find a happy medium somewhere. That said, I was a bit disappointed when I realised that there weren't really any stakes to the game. I did go into this blind, and I thought that Say No More had a lot of missed potential. Maybe as an offbeat RPG where you use different no's to accomplish different things, use office supplies to fight with, and team up with other like-minded anti-authoritarians to form a party. But I guess I'm describing a different game entirely there. Ultimately, it is a little tricky to recommend the game. As well as being fairly minimalistic when it comes to the gameplay, Say No More's not that long and doesn't have much replay value. At nearly £15, it's not the cheapest indie game out there either. That's not to say that I regret buying it, because the experience was a lot of fun, and definitely a unique vision from a team I'd like to see more from. I can just imagine people buying this and feeling kind of shortchanged at what's actually on offer, and I can understand this point of view too. There's more to say about this game, but that would probably require a whole video to itself. Luckily, one of my favourite YouTubers, Eurothug4000, has you covered with an excellent video on Say No More. I've put the link in the description and I thoroughly recommend it, so please go and watch hers. Preferably after watching mine, please? Going from the metropolis to the decidedly not metropolis, our next game is Mundaun, a unique first-person horror game. You play as a young man named Kurden, who heads to the eponymous town of Mundaun to attend his grandfather's funeral. After arriving, however, a series of bizarre occurrences seem to point at dark secrets hidden in the town's history, implying that his grandfather's death might not have been as accidental as it seems. The obvious first thing to comment on, and possibly the game's selling point, is its art direction. Mundaun is presented in a hand-drawn style that resembles sketches and the scrawlings in a notebook. While at first I thought these graphics would be confusing, making it difficult to discern one part of the landscape from another, it really doesn't take long for your eyes to adjust, and everything sticks out enough for you to navigate with ease. The graphics do a great job on two fronts. For one, they give the game an individual look that sticks out among the piles of horror games on Steam that just look like 3D asset flips. It's one of the factors that kept me playing to the end, just wanting to see more and more of this style. Secondly, they lend the game the exact sort of uncanny feel that a horror game like Mundaun needs. People's expressions look literally drawn on, the Movil you drive around in looks like a papier-mâché sculpture, and the town feels like you're trapped inside a haunted storybook. You feel unsettled throughout the game, like you've walked into a completely alien landscape, which is exactly how a game about an outsider coming to town should feel. The effect is only enhanced when you consider that the real Mundaun looks like this. Honestly, it's worth recommending the game for its art style alone, but the rest of it is pretty interesting too. Your search for answers takes you all over Mundaun, through caves and mountains, valleys and farms, and its story does a great job of further building the sense of mystery and suspense that the game starts out with. Unfortunately, and perhaps inevitably, it's not flawless. The combat never really feels satisfying, with each attack seeming to phase through enemies, rather than actually hitting them. It's not the point of the game, but it would have felt like a great little treat if the few encounters you had with enemies gave you a nice sense of feedback. The enemies themselves also start to feel somewhat lackluster the more you progress. The early game's strawmen are original and terrifying, causing a shiver to run down your spine whenever they spot you. The rest, save for one late game encounter, feel more like stock enemies, with overly familiar patterns and behaviours. Mundaun's biggest downside, however, is the way the story and direction of the game eventually play out. I won't spoil it here, obviously, but as you make your way towards the end, each subsequent set piece starts to feel contrived, eradicating the intrigue built up till now, and just leaving me disappointed. One particular sequence seemed designed only to set up a cheap jump scare, and then soon after you just carry on with your way and forget about it. With the exception of a brilliantly surreal endgame section within a cave in the mountain, much of the latter half of the game only serves to deflate the enigmatic atmosphere that had made the earlier Mundaun so compelling. Maybe the game's mysteries did need to be solved at some point, but there's something to be said for either leaving certain events to the player's imagination or revealing things more subtly, so that the player can put the pieces together without it just being waved in their face. It's easy enough for me to just say this though, and it is very hard to strike the right balance with horror. Usually the build-up and tension does its job well. Then suddenly the monster or the true evil has to appear, and then everything that came before deflates faster than a depressed balloon. In other cases, either you go too far over the top and everything becomes way too obvious, or you don't go far enough with your reveals and things just get confusing or pretentious. These are just some personal gripes, speaking purely from my own experience trying to write horror. I think writing horror well is very hard, and it is something that I personally struggle with. So this isn't just me looking down on the game's developer from an ivory tower or anything like that. Overall, Mundaun does wrap everything up conclusively and mostly satisfactorily, and its story was different enough to the norm that I did enjoy my time with it. If you're intrigued by the art style, unique setting, or want a fun little puzzle game that does horror without ripping off an overused trend, this might be the game for you. Plus, it's supported by about 12 different Swiss art councils, which, well, what else do you need? I imagine it's a comparison that's been done to death by now, but we can't really talk about Everhood without mentioning Undertale. The latter RPG really blew up the internet a few years ago, with its quirky sense of humour, deconstructive approach to the RPG genre, and iconic character design endearing it to loads of players. Considering its massive impact, you'd have thought it would inspire a whole bunch of copycat games attempting to imitate it. But for whatever reason, very few seem to have surfaced. That is of course with the exception of Everhood, a game that at first just seems like a parallel universe version of Undertale. The graphical style, character design, and little meta nods to the player are definitely extremely familiar, and the game surely wears its influences on its sleeve. But calling Everhood a ripoff would be inaccurate. All of the characters it introduces have distinctive personalities and designs, and are overly charming in their own right. There's no obvious Sans clone or equivalent, for example. Its story similarly deals with mortality and the importance of life, but takes a completely different angle to Undertale. And while it has its own quirky spin on an RPG battle system, the system itself couldn't be more distinct. While I usually appreciate media that tries something new over media that just regurgitates, Everhood feels more like two individuals heavily inspired by something, rather than trying to cash in on its success. With all that said, let's get into what Everhood actually is. It's a top-down adventure game where you control Red, a wooden doll whose arm is stolen by the greedy gold pig. As you venture to retrieve it, you get caught up in a number of diversions in this surreal world, learning little bits about Red's backstory and the history of the world as a whole. Perhaps the main appeal, however, are the eccentric cast of characters and the fights you engage in with them. To sum up the combat system, imagine someone else is playing Guitar Hero, and you're stuck on the tracks trying to avoid their notes. Later on you gain abilities that let you interact with these notes in different ways, but to say any more would be to spoil the surprise. At the start, all you can do is dodge and jump your way through the game's funky, trippy, groovy original soundtrack. These fights honestly carry the game, and though things can get a bit repetitive in Everhood's second half, the combat always keeps the momentum flowing. Some of the battles get really hard, but finishing them never stops feeling satisfying, and there are even a few super bosses to test your skills against. I do love my super bosses. The game also has a heavy psychedelic influence that comes through extremely strongly in some of the later battles, further cementing Everhood's individuality in the indie game scene, and contrasting it with the slightly more down-to-earth Undertale. I read an interview with the developers where they cite the trance band Spangle as one of their primary influences for the music, and if you've ever listened to Spangle, yeah, you know exactly what they're talking about. Psychedelia also underpins the philosophy running alongside the game, and it comes more into play during the game's later stages, leading to a truly memorable finale. In my opinion, more games should embrace psychedelia as enthusiastically as Everhood has. It seems to be a mostly untapped well, and while some designers use elements of it, it feels fresh to see a game fully designed around the concept, that doesn't just reduce it to character takes drugs, has weird vision. If you've played Undertale and weren't worn out by its intensely offbeat sense of style, I definitely recommend Everhood as a follow-up. If you were worn out by it, as I was, I still haven't played Deltarune, I would still recommend Everhood, but a little more tentatively. The dialogue and constant wackiness do get a little exhausting, but the combat is so different to anything else I've seen that it's more than worth a look. Plus, it has a frog. Alright, you guys have had fun for long enough. It's time for the Missing V's card game hour. I've resisted talking about card games since my Runeterra video, which is probably my least favourite out of all the videos I've done, so you get 2 in a row here. Firstly, let's talk about Storybook Brawl. I first tried this game out about the same time as a bunch of other disaffected Gwent players. The meta for Gwent was kinda bad, and I was looking for a card game to fill the void. This game drew my attention, and now I've put about 200 hours into it. Storybook Brawl is an auto-battler, where players enter a lobby, purchase characters from a shop, drop them onto the field, and then take turns fighting against the other players in the lobby. Once a brawl starts, your characters fight against each other automatically, without any further input from the player. Once all of their characters are destroyed, the losing player takes damage depending on the opposing player's level and how many opposing characters are left on the field. Once a player's health reaches 0, they're booted out of the lobby, and gain or lose ranking points depending on their placement, and the last player remaining wins the most points out of everyone. There are other mechanics of course, but this is a very quick summation of how the game plays. I'm not usually a fan of auto-battler games, and grew bored with almost everyone I played within about 10 minutes of starting it up. However, there is something really appealing about Storybook Brawl. The simple stats for each card, easy to understand effects, and potential for interesting builds all helped me get into and understand how the game worked. I imagine it plays a lot like the Hearthstone auto-battler, Battlegrounds, but I'm not really touching Activision games at the moment for reasons. Whenever you start a new match, you have absolutely no idea which leader you're going to get or which cards you're going to see, which is really interesting early on and tempted me to play again and again. The limited amount of interaction also makes it really easy to play while doing something else. After buying your characters and arranging your board, you sometimes have a little bit of time between fights, where you can get on with work, browse the internet, or whatever else you want to do. It's a very casual game and a lot less intensive than something like Gwent, where every one of your decisions is crucial and one mistake can potentially cost you the match. However, the level of variance is a double-edged sword. While there is undoubtedly skill involved in Storybook Brawl, and good players have the potential to rise in the ranks, the reliance on luck can far outweigh it. When starting the game, you might get a bad leader, setting you back right from the start, and there are some real trash leaders. Then you might not get any character cards that pair well together, leaving you miles behind when your opponents roll into a perfectly synergized team. Then you might not find 3 copies of a character, meaning you can't upgrade them, you might get bad treasures, you might not get any decent spells in your shop, and meanwhile, your opponent might get all of these things, leaving them miles ahead. All of this combined can lead to frustrating games where it feels like you're being cheated out of a good time for reasons beyond your control. As I say, there's obviously skill in here somewhere, knowing which characters to pick from the shop, which team compositions work, and which treasures to hunt for. But even after spending this much time on the game, I can't tell how many of my victories are skill-based, and how many of them are just me rolling into the right characters and treasures in the right order. It's important that card games have an element of luck, because otherwise it just becomes chess, and I don't think anyone that plays a card game actually wants that, even though balance is often held up as the be-all and end-all in the card game scene. However, there is a line, and once you cross that line, it feels like you might as well just be rolling dice. Storybook Brawl tends to dance on the line pretty often. It's a weird experience that I imagine is pretty familiar to fans of auto-battlers, not getting the right build or a build that's effective in any way. But this is completely alien to me, because I'm used to playing these games with decks that have already been built prior to the match. If you're a fan of card games or auto-battlers, and you're able to ignore the potential frustration that naturally comes with a game of this kind, it might be one for you. The developers are very active on Discord and are constantly patching the game, so it's extremely well supported. And I believe there are former Magic the Gathering pros on the dev team, so they know their card games. It's also free to play, with leaders costing $7 or £5 each if you don't have the dust to spend on them. I'm unsure how I feel about the ethics of charging money for leaders that you have to hope come up, rather than leaders you can actually actively choose. So maybe treat this one with a side eye if you don't want to play a lot to earn your in-game currency. Out of all the hours I've played of Storybook Brawl, I'd definitely say I had a good time overall. So definitely give it a shot if you like card games. I drop back in every patch to have a game or two, but up at the higher ranks I find more annoyance than fun nowadays. Well, at least there's Master Duel. Yu-Gi-Oh can't possibly be annoying, right? Inscryption was probably the most well-known card game that came out this year, having had its popularity boosted after being picked up by lots of well-known Let's Players. Of course, as it's a card game, I had to play it too. After playing a bit, you can definitely see where all the attention came from. The premise is really interesting. You're a nameless protagonist, trapped in a cabin somewhere in the woods, held prisoner by a mysterious figure who forces you to play a roguelike tabletop game with him. The game itself mainly consists of you moving through a Slay the Spire style branching path, fighting card battles against various enemies, with a boss at the end of each stage. Depending on which route you take, you can receive various upgrades to your deck, new cards, or gain items that can help you in battle. Outside the game you can explore the cabin, completing puzzles and piecing together items survival horror style to give you more of an advantage at the table and, eventually, help you find a way out of your predicament. Everything about Inscryption initially seems extremely compelling. The card battles themselves are addictive, playing kind of like Yu-Gi-Oh crossed with Magic. although a more niche comparison would be Force of Will. One deck holds your main cards and the other holds squirrels, which are like your basic resources. At the start of your turn, you draw one card from either, then you can play a squirrel for free, or a more powerful animal by sacrificing squirrels or other animals on your board. Sacrificing animals also gives you another resource, bones, which can be used to play other cards. Once you're done playing cards, you hit a bell, and your cards automatically attack either opposing animals or your opponent directly, dropping teeth into a scale for every direct hit. Once a player accrues 5 teeth in their scale, the battle's over and they lose. The resource system, which lets you play as many cards as you like as long as you can pay for them, leads to some really fun combinations. The rules are really easy to understand, but open-ended enough that you can thoroughly break the game if you know how. If you're a fan of card games, you'll especially get a ton of fun out of barreling through your entire deck in one turn and creating cards with loads of attack, or pulling off crazy combos just for fun. Whenever you hit a game over, you have to draft your deck from scratch, with the exception of a few cards that can be carried over. This means that the game never gets repetitive or feels boring, and every playthrough is shaken up at least a little bit whenever you start again. And you'll probably start again quite a bit because some of the bosses and stages can get kind of tricky. Thankfully, even fighting the bosses over and over doesn't get too frustrating. The animation and character models look so good, you don't really mind seeing them over and over. There's one particular animation where an animal head gets decisively screwed into a base that's really particularly satisfying. Out of context, that sounds weird, but trust me, it's pretty cool. Up till now, it seems like I rate Inscryption pretty highly, and yes, up until now it is very good. When I finished it, I thought, that was short, but I was very happy with the time that I'd had. However, without going into any spoilers, at a certain point the game changes. It recontextualizes everything you've played so far and introduces new gameplay and story elements that alter the experience. I went into this game completely blind, and I hadn't even played the developer's previous work, which includes the quite notorious Pony Island. As such, maybe it's my fault for not really knowing what to expect, but I found everything after this particular moment tedious, drawn out, and ultimately unenjoyable. There's a meta-narrative running alongside the game that's very good and really shows that the game's developer either loves or thoroughly researched trading card culture prior to making the game. The end of this narrative proved to be divisive for many players, but to me it made sense. Though there were a myriad of loose ends and open questions still, the game itself was functionally concluded. My problems with it start after the game's end. The game's plot is apparently further expanded on in an ARG, taking place outside the game itself, which was a conclusion that made me feel really shortchanged. If you're on the front lines of an ARG, exploring new information and chatting with other people to solve its mystery, it can be really exciting. I've taken part in one before, poring over sources and evidence with fellow detectives in order to unlock the secrets of the game, so I can attest to how entertaining it has the potential to be. However, the ARG to Inscryption was pretty much solved by the time I'd finished the game, and got round to reading all of the Google Docs that compiled the information, so the whole ordeal felt more like homework than anything else. What's worse, the story that people managed to piece together was essential backstory to Inscryption that answers many of the questions that were left lingering after the game was over. If this was all planned out and intended to be included in the project as a whole, why wasn't it in the game itself? In the section about Mundaun, I mentioned that sometimes it can be good to leave a little bit of mystery to let players decide for themselves how certain events end up resolving. Inscryption the game does this, which I think would have been fine. Inscryption the multimedia meta-textual project doesn't. There's swathes of lore and storytelling hidden behind this ARG, participation in which is now equivalent to reading a Wikipedia article. And the story is all now on the Wikipedia article for Inscryption, so why not just do that instead? This is probably my most controversial take on this game, and maybe I just don't understand the creators' intentions, or why they do an ARG in the first place when the actual game they made is right there. I understand the potential that the internet as a virtual environment has for telling different kinds of stories, especially in conjunction with a video game, another virtual space. But if the only people able to benefit from it are those that are the very first to explore it, it just kind of feels exclusionary to me. So yeah, very long bit about Inscryption, and I have no idea whether to recommend the game or not. I suppose the best thing for me to say is that once I was done with the initial story arc, I did feel like my money had been well spent, so if you're intrigued by the premise and might be able to handle it changing, sure, go for it. I just was really not as impressed by this one as I thought I would be, as I wanted to be too, and that's just very sad. Alright, now it's high time I talked about another game I actually enjoyed last year. Ultrakill filled the FPS-shaped hole in my life that I gained after finishing Doom Eternal. A game so good I really wanted to put it in this video, despite it coming out in 2020. Ultrakill's concept is pretty straightforward. After humanity goes extinct, you, a killer robot named V1, invade Hell to gorge yourself on the blood of its inhabitants. Though there are bits of additional lore in the boss battles that pop up later, this premise is all you really need to know. Unlike the new Doom games, Ultrakill doesn't spend too much time setting up a huge universe and characters. The focus here is very much on the gameplay. And needless to say, it doesn't disappoint. If you're looking for a straight up shooter that revolves around clearing rooms full of demons in the goriest, most extravagant way, Ultrakill will be right up your alley. Well, more like your whole street. Your kit is fairly simple. You have 4 weapons with both primary and secondary fire, 4 secondary fire variations, an air dash, a ground pound, and a melee attack. As you blast through opponents, you're scored by a system inspired by Devil May Cry, where style and diversity are rewarded with more of those tasty points. As such, switching weapons frequently and combining your tools are key to hitting those high scores and climbing up the rankings. That said, this is something you're just going to be doing anyway though, because most of the weapons are extremely fun to use, balancing familiar mechanics with some original ideas. Though my aim's nowhere near good enough to hit it consistently, my personal favourite is the pistol variant, where you flip a coin into the air then shoot it, turning your ricocheted bullets into a superpowered death shot. The weapon diversity might not be as large as something like Doom, but the game never gets boring. Enemies are introduced at a rapid pace, forcing you to adapt and use your arsenal in different ways in order to get the better of them. The enemy designs are also really creative, going in different directions to the age-old generic demon and generic demon with wings you might expect from a game about Hell. I'm not going to spoil them here, but there are some really cool and unique guys to fight, and even the lower level zombie grunts are fun to look at. Well, for the picosecond before you blast them into oblivion, that is. Speaking of looks, the industrial level design and graphics really help create an oppressive, claustrophobic atmosphere. The graphics are also adjustable, letting you make things even more and more pixelated until you reach the exact retro aesthetic you want, from PSX to Game Boy Advance. Maybe this is just a thing for gamers of a certain generation, but the low poly graphical style and blocky bright red blood remind me of playing something like Mortal Kombat 4 when I was way too young for it to be appropriate. It just helps remind me of the illicit feeling of playing a grown-up video game as a tiny child, bringing back that reminder of forbidden delight that I, as a jaded and desensitized adult, have long forgotten. Man, that was depressing. Oh well. There's really not a huge amount left to say. The game's in early access, so it's not completely finished yet, but there's still lots to love here and get stuck into. Above everything, it's a great game to jump on once you've been on a losing streak in something else. Blasting a bunch of demons into meaty chunks really makes you feel like you're good at video games again, if only for a little while. As a disclaimer, this probably doesn't work for League of Legends, but I'm pretty sure uninstalling does. Alright, I was gonna do 10 of these, but this video is already way too long, so let's just call this the last one. The person who introduced me to Loop Hero called it a roguelike, which was enough for me to just count it out entirely. I understand why roguelikes are so popular in the indie scene. They allow for a huge amount of replayability and variety in gameplay, letting indie developers explore an idea in lots of different ways, without the drains on finances or other resources it would otherwise take. However, I find that the overall enjoyment you can get from these games depends on how much you like the initial loop. If you're not fond of the first few playthroughs, you're probably not gonna like the rest of it. This is partly why I haven't played much of Supermassive Games' much adored Hades. Though the game's writing, graphics and character design are excellent, I played a few runs then got bored, and I haven't been back to it since. That said, Loop Hero is something different. As soon as I actually saw it in action, I was immediately interested, and it gripped me in a way that no other roguelike has. 30 hours of gameplay later, let's talk about it. The world has been obliterated, with all time and memory reduced to absolute zero. All, that is, except for a single knight, who sets out on a repetitive but noble journey to recall more and more of the world he once knew. The bulk of the game takes place on a looping path, starting and ending at a campfire. The knight moves automatically, making his way along the path and fighting enemies without any input from the player. You take on more of a guiding role, managing the knight's loadout and also the entire world around him. You start out with no inventory and a completely empty map, except for a few basic slimes haunting the route. Killing these slimes grants you not only equipment that can be used to strengthen the knight, but also cards representing different landmarks from the old world, each with different effects. Some towers are placed on or around the path itself, spawning different types of enemies, modifying the knight's behaviour, and letting you collect a variety of resources, with each card offering a different resource. You spend said resources between loops in a village that acts like a central hub. Collecting more resources lets you build more structures, bringing people back from oblivion, and granting multiple options to improve your expeditions. These can come in the form of minor passive buffs and new classes for the knight to play as, but the main benefit is acquiring new cards to modify the world during your loops. You arrange these cards into decks, and players can build multiple decks to switch between depending on which resources they want to gather, or just whichever world they want to create. Getting the right balance of cards that buff enemies and cards that buff the knight is important. If you put everything into strengthening your knight's stats, you might miss out on high level resources from more powerful enemies. However, if you overbuff the enemies, their strength might just get out of control, leading to you losing most of the items you gathered during the loop. As the emphasis on looping might have implied, it's a very grindy game, so my initial statement rings true. If you don't like the first few loops, you're probably not gonna stick with it. Some of the resources you need to finish later buildings are extremely rare drops, meaning you'll have to enjoy running expeditions over and over again to hopefully get the cards you need from monsters to farm them. I really liked the game's general structure, so even this stuff didn't bother me. Not having to worry about the actions you take in battle lets you focus on building up the knight and surrounding world, lending a really fun strategic element to the game. As you've probably guessed from the video so far, I also love card games, so placing down these landmark cards and combining their effects to create efficient worlds is also really enjoyable. While there are only 3 different classes to play as, they're all unique enough that each player will be able to pick out a favourite, though one class in particular seems quite objectively better than the others, and probably better suited to tanking their way through the game's more difficult later chapters. The sense of tangible progression as your village gets bigger and more complex does a great job in making you feel like all of these loops are actually getting you somewhere. The villagers that join you are great too. They have really vibrant personalities and distinctive sprite work. Some more distinctive than others. So that's Loop Hero. By now you probably know whether you're interested in the game or not. Well, you probably knew about 5 minutes ago, so what more do I need to say? It's a fun little way to spend a few minutes if you want a break, or if you just want to play something while you watch a video or movie. To conclude, I guess shoutouts to the second loop-based video game I've talked about on my channel this year. 2 isn't a lot, I know, but it's strange to hit the same very specific condition twice in the same month. And that's it. Thanks for watching. I hope you found something interesting in this video, maybe heard of a game that you were unaware of, or saw a game that looked fun. The next video might take a little while. I've got a lot going on in February and I could really do with taking some time off. So expect the next one in a couple of months or so. For now, stay well and I'll see you next time.